friends, this morning in our other services, we are actually continuing a sermon series called Giving It Up. And in that sermon series, we looked at different things that we could give up, behaviors that God would want us to give up for Lent, not just for Lent, but for the rest of our lives. And in this service, we are focusing on the discovery of the empty tomb. And so I am reading from Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the tomb rolled away from the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified on the third day, and on the third day rise again?" Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. May God add wisdom to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. I know this may be an obvious statement, but men and women are different. Yeah, it is a simple statement of fact, but in this day and age of gender equality and equal pay for equal work, sometimes I think this simple biological fact gets lost in the proverbial shuffle. All we have to do is take a look at us, right? Us men and women, and we see that there are obvious physical differences. But when it comes to the things that are less obvious, how different are we, really? Well, one might think that since both genders have brains, and both genders have feelings, that from an intellectual standpoint and a feeling standpoint, that we would be pretty much the same. But the truth is, when it comes to the way we think and the way we feel, men and women are different. Very different. We think and feel differently. We solve problems differently. We even communicate differently. And the list goes on and on. Let's take, for example, the art of problem solving. Now, according to an article written by Michael G. Connor, a clinical and medical psychologist, the female brain has 4 times the number of neurons that connect the right and the left sides of the brain. Yes. Which means that females are more efficient at using both sides of their brains when it comes to solving problems. Males, on the other hand, rely more heavily on the left side of their brain when it comes to solving problems. That's the side that handles information methodically. So men tend to solve problems one step at a time. They do it in a methodical manner, and they focus on results. Whereas women tend to solve problems in such a way that builds relationships with one another. Results are not as important to women, generally speaking, as the relationships that are built in the process. Dr. Connor also suggests that there's a physiological difference
in the way that men and women remember things. Men tend to remember things by associating them with a physical experience or activity, whereas women tend to recall events that are bound together by emotions. When emotions are involved, memories are stronger for women. And when emotions and relationships combine, these memories are especially significant and long-lasting. How do we know all of this stuff? Well, through the self-help industry, of course. After all, there are many self-help books, like one called The Delusions of Gender, or Why Gender Matters, or Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. Remember that book? Those books, though, have helped us understand more fully the differences between men and women, boys and girls. And lest we think the ideas presented in these books were simply pulled out of a hat, there are a lot of studies, scientific studies, that support these differences between men and women. So as 21st century people, we naturally have a better understanding of how our brains work in connection with our feelings and our emotions. But in Jesus' day, things were very different. Folks back then didn't understand there was more than just the physical difference between men and women. And because women were, generally speaking, physically smaller and weaker, they were treated generally more inferior to men. They were thought to be inferior to men. Back in Jesus' day, they didn't understand that when it came to procreation, both genders contributed equally. Nor did they always believe that women contributed equally to the success of the family or the community. And when women came together, as they built relationships with one another, often these relationships, which were vital to their very existence, they were often considered by the men as just taking part in idle chatter or idle talk. In general, women were not respected in Jesus' day, nor were they held in high esteem by the men. Which has led me to wonder, how is it that the women came to discover the empty tomb? And more importantly, why did the men who wrote the Gospels admit that it was the women who made this significant discovery? Well, some have argued that it was merely a coincidence, that the women, that it was them going to the empty tomb, or going to the tomb in general, was because of their womanly obligations. You see, after Jesus was crucified and his body was removed from the cross, Scripture tells us that his body was wrapped in a linen cloth and then placed in an empty tomb, one that had not been used. But because the Sabbath was upon them, they didn't have time to properly prepare his body for burial. And so they left him there during the Sabbath. But under Jewish tradition, this argument goes, that it was up to the women to prepare the ointments and spices that would then be used in order to prepare Christ's body and anoint him in order to have a proper burial for him. So the women's journey from the tomb, this argument goes, was a part of their normal responsibilities. It was part of the tradition and part of their necessity. It was required that Jesus would receive a proper burial. So when they discovered that the empty tomb, or that the tomb was empty, in general, it was just a coincidence that they happened to be there at that time. Nothing more and nothing less. Now, others have suggested that the reason the women went to the tomb was because the men were afraid. They were afraid they might be next. Those disciples thought that the religious authorities might be after them, so they sent the women to the tomb instead to scope out the situation in the garden. Now, according to this argument, which points to Mark's gospel, we know that when Jesus was arrested, the disciples ran away. And in John's gospel, he tells us that eventually they came back together into the upper room where they stayed behind locked doors. They feared the Jewish authorities, that they might discover them and take them away. But because Jesus' body had not been properly prepared, someone had to leave the safety of the room. I can hear the disciples now. Send the women. Nobody will question the women in the garden. No one will suspect anything if the women go. So the women went out because the men were afraid, this theory says. And as a result, they were the first to bear witness to the risen Christ. Now, both of these are plausible theories. But what if they are wrong? What if God specifically chose the women to discover the empty tomb because of the way their brains would have processed the information that they saw? Think about it. If the disciples, all of whom were male, had been the first to discover the empty tomb, it's very likely that their brains would have gone into problem-solving mode. They would have stood there wondering, how in the world did this happen? What could we have done differently to keep Jesus' body from being taken away from the cave? Or who was responsible for this? We need to go after them and do something about this. But Luke says that the women saw and they remembered. They remembered the way that Jesus had treated them. They remembered how he had told them that he would have to be crucified, and then 3 days he would rise again. They remembered because of the emotional attachment they undoubtedly felt between them and Christ, born out of the way that he treated them with respect and dignity, not as not as other men had treated them. Because Jesus' ministry was all about relationship. And for women, relationships are the key. The women would have remembered how so much of Jesus' time and energy was spent building relationships with others, especially those who were on the margins, like the women. They would have remembered how he had taught that they too were meant to build relationships with others. And by building relationships, Jesus' movement would grow, even after his death on the cross. So knowing this, knowing what we know about women's brains and the differences between our brains, I don't think it was an accident or a coincidence that it was the women who discovered the empty tomb and the resurrected Christ. I think it was part of God's grand scheme. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that without the women, God's message of love would have died along with him on the cross. No, because the scripture says that the women went back and told the disciples who went out and spread the good news. What I am saying, however, is that women played a significant role in spreading that news by telling the male disciples that Jesus was alive. And because of that, we simply cannot dismiss their voices. We cannot dismiss anyone's voice when it comes to bearing witness to God's love through Jesus Christ. Oh, we might disagree with each other. We might not agree with what we are each saying, because that's the way God made us. Our brains are different, and so we process information differently. But even though we might disagree, we can find common ground. The fact that the women were the first to experience resurrection lends credence to the fact that we are all called to bear witness to the love of Christ and the good news of God's love in our lives. My friends, our task as Easter people, as resurrection people, is to spread the good news of God's love for all. We are called as ambassadors to Jesus Christ to not only live the gospel, but to share the gospel message by inviting others to be a part of the movement right here in this place, here at Song of Life United Methodist Church. Even if it means being called to get up at early dawn, even if it means that we are expected to shout the good news, and that is exactly what we are expected to do. We are expected to shout and share the good news. Say it with me. Christ is alive.
Christ is alive.
Christ is risen.
Christ is risen.
He is alive in us.
He is alive in us.
Amen.
Amen.